First of all, we see a lack of courage.
Yeah.
Secondly, we see a misunderstanding of what it calls to advance the gospel of the kingdom. Because when you look at Jesus' life, you cannot find an example, I can't, where Jesus chased after somebody who wasn't interested or rejecting what he said. In fact, in John 6, he goes so far as to talk about those who would follow me must eat my flesh, drink my blood, which would have been horrific to a Jew at the time he said it. It says most of his followers left. He turns to his closest disciples and say, "Are you going to leave too?" That's not exactly the kind of marketing campaign we would employ today to try to bring people to church. So I would say to that pastor, you've got it all wrong.
Welcome to the Christian Citizen, part of the ministry of U.S. Pastor Council. We take head on the mission of restoring godly citizenship as an effective ministry of the local Bible-believing pastor and church. Man calls it politics, but God calls it ministry, and our mission of, by, and for pastors is to bring a united biblical voice to the critical issues of our day. Scripture speaks to all issues impacting lives, and so should our pulpits. Join us for today's program. Hi, I'm Dave Welch, and in today's Christian Citizen podcast, we're going to be talking to a friend of mine we've been working together for just a year or two, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But as you know, the mission and purpose of this podcast of the Christian Citizen is to address the why and the how that we have as a role as followers of Christ in this country as citizens of both heaven and the United States of America. But talk about that today. We'll go way back to 1992 when I was bivocational, running a service station and getting involved in church ministry, but also getting deeply involved in the grassroots level of the pro-life, pro-family movement that God had drawn me into. So had not yet full clarity on how that was all going to fit together. And God brought through a series of things at that time into my life an individual who has really been a mentor. I want to introduce Guy Rodgers. Guy, I'm going to read you your official bio, then I'll give the real one after that.
Okay.
The expanded version, shall we say. Guy Rodgers is certified as a professional leadership coach by the Professional Christian Coaching Institute, regarded as one of the nation's premier organizations dedicated to the training of high-level coaches. Frequently referred to by colleagues as a leader of leaders, Rodgers has worked with, coached, and been a consultant to leaders in the education, business, political, nonprofit, and Christian ministry sectors, as well as holding a number of executive leadership positions within these sectors. He is currently the president of Flourishing Leadership, whose motto is Unleashing the Fullness of Your Leadership Calling. Rodgers founded Flourishing Leadership to provide coaching, consult, and community to Christian leaders who desire to live authentically from their Christ-given identities and rise to the fullness of their leadership callings. Among the many positions Rodgers has held since 1986, his most recent one prior to launching his leadership coaching practice in 2020 was as president and CEO of Pinnacle Forum, a national network of Christian leaders in all walks of life, whose motto is Transforming Leaders Who Transform Culture. Rodgers is a past member of the National Register's Who's Who in Executives and Professionals and a life member of the National Registry of Who's Who. He is a graduate of the Buckley School of Public Speaking, recognized as the premier public speaking training school for CEOs, executives, and other professionals, where he was awarded both the Silver Medal for Oratorical Excellence and the Orators Award, the latter of which has been awarded to fewer than 5% of the school's attendees over the past 25 years. Now, Guy, when I first connected with you, you were the National Field Director for Christian Coalition, and the founding National Field Director for that organization, which eventually became the strongest grassroots-based pro-family organization in the country. We've really not had anything of its type since then. What I've learned along the way was that the effectiveness of that organization and its grassroots structure was largely due to your vision and your experience on the ground. But that really began in Iowa, didn't it? Let's just back up a little bit before that even, and just tell us a little bit about how did you come to Christ? Did you grow up in the church? What led you to that personal faith in Jesus Christ?
Yeah, I did not grow up in the church. As a matter of fact, my family was about as thoroughly secular as you could imagine. And I like to illustrate it this way because for people who grew up in the church, they may not understand what that actually means. So when I was 16, I didn't understand what those little T's were on top of church buildings. I'd drive by and go, what's that? Not knowing, of course, that's a cross. I was dramatically saved at a Young Life camp in Colorado the summer after I graduated from high school. Didn't know a lot, had only vague familiarity with the Bible because I'd been going to Young Life Club on and off for about 9 months. But God met me in a very dramatic way, to the degree that literally as I was walking the camp that night and looking at the stars, and literally scales fell off my eyes in that I saw things physically different. When I got back to where everybody was reconvening for the end of that night's meeting, some of the friends that I had met there looked at me and said, "What happened to you?" And I said, "I'm not exactly sure," but that was the beginning. I like to say that Jesus saved me, even though I didn't know the difference between a Baptist and a Buddhist at that time. And that began a journey that is now 50 years old, back last August. So that's the brief story.
Awesome. Well, that's profound because that really charted your course, didn't it?
It did.
You started out in education, didn't you? That was professionally?
Yes. Yep. After college, I taught in a public high school for 5 years. And during that time was discipled by the president of the Omaha Bible School for 4 years. I will say as an aside that I am such a passionate believer in the Jesus model of discipleship because first of all, it's biblical, and second of all, because of what I experienced. And that was, so getting saved, and then that trajectory 5 years later of being discipled for 4 years while I was a public school teacher. During that time, God did a remarkable thing at the school I was, and that was he literally stirred up a spiritual revival with all the good, the wonderful, and the oppression and the ridicule and the mocking and the persecution that came with it. So I got to experience firsthand, and that was 40 years ago. I got to experience firsthand what happens when God moves and you have the courage to move with him, even though my zeal probably far exceeded my knowledge and certainly exceeded my maturity, and yet God used it anyway. So we had at least 3 teachers got saved that I know of, and how many dozens of high school students. So that took me to 1982, and then I moved to Iowa, bought a family business, and was planning to live there, run a family business, and do a quote-unquote Christian ministry. And then that changed too.
And then God interrupted your plans again.
And
so Iowa, other than corn and other things that apart from politics, when it comes to the political arena, everybody goes right immediately to the epicenter of the presidential campaign world. But what really got you involved in the grassroots level of the political action?
Well, another interesting twist. I wasn't looking for that. Matter of fact, if you'd asked me in 1982 that you're going to end up following a trajectory into the world of politics and government, I would have laughed. That wasn't on the radar screen at all. It came about as a result of some individuals that I got to know who began inviting me to various grassroots meetings that were concerned very much about education in Iowa. People don't recall, or most people don't recall, that back at this time, which would be the middle 1980s, that Iowa had some of the strictest laws in the nation with respect to Christian schools and homeschools.
Strictest in what way? They were limiting them?
Yes.
Okay.
They were. In fact, I can remember, fast forwarding a few years, but I can remember in 1987 standing on the steps of the courthouse in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, with a pastor and his wife who went to jail for 30 days for conducting a, quote, non-accredited church school of about 25 students.
Wow.
So what happened was, over the course of I'd say about 3 years, God was kind of slowly pulling me into this arena because of my background in education. And it culminated in me being asked in 1986 to be the lobbyist for an emerging coalition of church schools and homeschools. It was a very interesting theological coalition. The church schools were independent fundamental Baptist, and of course, homeschoolers theologically are all over the map. And yet that was the call. And at first I said no, eventually said yes. Long and the short of it is that in the state that year, 1987, we came within a whisker of getting legislation passed that would have loosened up the laws, despite every single political power player in Iowa's legislature saying, we're wasting our time, including the Speaker of the House who told me that. And it just showed the potential and the ability that when Christians will come together and they'll employ good strategies, do things well, do things in love, but do things well with courage, that you can, in fact, quote unquote, take on City Hall. It's a remarkable story. The end of the story is this. We didn't get it past that year in 87. There's a long story behind that as to why we didn't. But 2 years later, legislation was passed. And the lead on that legislation was a member of the House who was elected in 1988, a homeschooler, a farmer who went through my training programs, grassroots training program back in 1986, 87. So it took a few years, but it did change. And the upshot for your listeners is that many states were looking at Iowa to see what would happen here with respect to legislation, because Iowa had arguably, if not the strongest, certainly one of the strongest public teachers unions in the country that were adamantly opposed to this. And when that legislation passed, freed up church schools and homeschoolers to have the liberty to actually educate their children, other states followed suit. And instead of having this massive national crisis, that deflated it. Because if you think back to the 90s, it didn't happen. And state after state liberalized their laws. I'm not saying they all looked at Iowa, but I know a fair number of them did. And so that's an example of the ripple effect that came out of that state and the centrality of that state in terms of the conflict that was emerging. Because when you put a pastor and a wife in jail who are law-abiding people for running a church school, that gets people's attention.
Absolutely. Well, and we're so much talking today about the threats against religious liberty and the practice and against the church. This isn't new. And most people that don't know, or maybe have even forgotten about that time period where as recently as the 1980s in the United States, that homeschooling was illegal in most states. And I'm from Washington State, as you know. I was a beneficiary. I got involved in this arena in about 84, but was really just getting my feet wet and learning a lot. So I wasn't really part of the major push that legalized homeschooling in Washington in 1986. But it had a chance to work directly around and with those who were men like Pastor Lyle Bollinger, who's gone to be with the Lord now, who was a champion, who was threatened with arrest, same thing during that time.
Yep.
So we could go that direction so deeply, and another time we will, because there's so much just history here to what has been done on that issue in education. But one of the things that I've seen and learned from you, Guy, along the years is that, first of all, our civic involvement is very important, and how we do it, and we can be effective and we can be organized. But what the why is critically important. I think what we both observed, and I certainly began to see in those years, was that too many of our Christian evangelical brethren and sisters that were involved maybe were involved doing the right thing, maybe for the wrong reasons, or at least partially so. That a biblical worldview is really essential to our founding point. Do you believe that Christians have a biblical mandate for active citizenship, or is it just an American civic thing?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to answer it two ways. The first is, we often quote Romans 13, where it talks about, obeying the governing authorities. What is, I think, frequently missed is that really what Paul is giving in that chapter is a brief treatise on what it means to be a good citizen. Now, in Rome at that time, they had no voting rights. Citizens didn't have voting rights. They didn't have the rights that we take for granted today. So if Paul had written Romans 13 by saying, now be a good citizen and make sure you vote and so on, people would have had, what are you talking about? I had no clue. So start there and say, you have to take the context of it. And the context was, be a good citizen. All right, now fast forward to the United States of America, a very unique country in the history of the world, with a law system, and a governing system founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and ethics, and rights and privileges that most of the world would have never dreamed of prior to 1776. That means that when you take Romans 13, you now have to look at it through the lens of what kind of system do we live in? And what does it mean thus to be a good citizen in this system? And a good citizen in this system, at the very least, means what? Informed voting. That's the bare minimum, because we have that privilege. We have that right that people in North Korea could only dream of having. People in communist China could only dream of having. So I begin there. But secondly, beyond that, we have a moral imperative as Christians to be salt and light. Now, we hear that all the time. We'll hear it in our churches, and usually salt is, well, it's meant to be a preservative and a flavoring and so on, which as far as that goes is true. But when I did a study on this, and I looked up some of the best known commentators, biblical commentators historically, like Albert Barnes, Matthew Poole, people like that. Interesting what I found when it came to salt. They all were saying the same things, and it boiled down to this. You have a calling to be a bulwark against moral decay in society. It wasn't that none of them spoke about salt being saved. It was always about we are called against moral decay and to stand for justice. So my question is this: how do you do that if you're going to avoid the system that actually employs justice, as Paul talks about, wields the sword for justice? How do you do that? How do you do that if you're going to say, well, we're not going to be involved in education, or we're not going to be involved in the entertainment industry, or we're not going to be involved in media, which is where we see today moral decay happening and being fomented on a grand scale? How are we to be salt if we're going to avoid all of those arenas of life? And remember, let's remember what Jesus said. Right. He said, if the salt loses its saltiness, what is it good for? It is good for nothing except to be trampled underfoot by men. I would suggest to your listeners, what's happening today to Christianity in America? It is being trampled underfoot by men. And God is allowing that because he's trying to get Christians to wake up to the fact that the gospel of the kingdom is more than salvation. Yes, salvation is the door into it. Then after that, we have a call to be advancers of his kingdom, and that's in all areas of life, because that's what being salt means, unless those biblical commentators are all wrong, and I would submit they aren't.
Absolutely. What's interesting in the passage in Matthew 5 is that those verses follow just a few verses before the Beatitudes. It says, blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake.
Right.
And it's so easy to take the self-righteous position when we face persecution, or we see that happening in this country. Well, that's because we're being persecuted for Jesus' sake. Well, the question before the church today is, are we so Christian that persecution is effectively rising up when we measure it on a scale of history back to literally the founding of the church? Or are we a saltless, flavorless entity that is being trampled upon because we have earned contempt because we don't stand and believe anything? And that's a really valid part of that dialogue. You know, in Romans 13, too, Guy, I think, and that's in this whole concept of we have a biblical duty. One of the things you first learn in seminary at the very beginning is this concept of canonicity. What that means is basically, why are things in Scripture when things were being considered to be included, the letters, the writings, at the time of the formation of what we now, the New Testament. Canonicity, one of the components of that is these principles in that letter were to be applicable to all believers at all times,
right,
of all places, right? So in Romans 13, God uses the word ordained to apply to governing authority. Now, when we say, are you ordained, or somebody's ordained, or we immediately go to this, you're ordained minister, right? We apply that to the church. But God ordained a governing authority. And then that passage gives us the basics of those principles that apply to all peoples of all times. One of the things that we've wrestled with, Guy, that you've been involved with for years, it's this whole framework of the evangelical vote.
Right.
So when we got to things like the Pat Robertson campaign in Iowa in 1988, Iowa is kind of the epicenter of the universe in the primaries in the Republican side, in the presidential races. and we get to deal with this constant issue of how do we get the Christians to get out and vote. When we see that dynamic and those numbers as low as they are, is that still because the church isn't promoting that? What do you see as the disconnect there? Well, while we constantly have to struggle with that issue.
I think there are multiple issues here. So let me try to highlight them quickly. Number one, in my experience, and I've lived all over the country, I've run political campaigns, I've worked for Christian organizations, I've been around Christian leaders. It is common for pastors to be reticent, if not fearful, of crossing the line into what is called politics. Somehow, this is outside the realm of what they should be dealing with. And the pushback typically comes in two ways. It may be, I offend someone who's a big donor in my church. Well, I don't want to do that. Or, oh, wow, I might lose my tax-exempt status. I can think of a specific example of this with pastors. It was in a church that I went to in Florida about 2012. Our pastor did a really good message on same-sex marriage. It was very balanced, biblical truth, biblical love. Afterwards, I asked him things he did to prepare for it. And he said, one of the things I did is I talked to about a dozen pastor friends of mine, all of whom are Orthodox, Bible-believing, lead evangelical churches. And to a man, they all said they wouldn't touch that issue with a 10-foot pole. One of them even went so far as to say, I'm a pastor of a large church in a suburban area. We have a lot of millennials. If I touch that, well, a lot of these would walk out and they wouldn't have a chance to hear the gospel. So we see two things there. First of all, we see a lack of courage.
Yeah.
But secondly, we see a misunderstanding of what it calls to advance the gospel of the kingdom. Because when you look at Jesus' life, you cannot find an example, I can't, where Jesus chased after somebody who wasn't interested or rejecting what he said. In fact, in John 6, he goes so far as to talk about those who would follow me must eat my flesh, drink my blood, which would have been horrific to a Jew at the time he said it. It says most of his followers left. He turns to his closest disciples and say, are you going to leave too? That's not exactly the kind of marketing campaign we would employ today to try to bring people to church. So I would say to that pastor, you've got it all wrong. Not that you beat people over the head with it, but your avoidance of this issue of truth in the hopes you're going to bring people to the gospel is a slippery slope, which means, well, what about the next issue and the next issue, to where you get to the point where, let's face it, Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church USA, Methodist churches today, and that is the classic, if you don't believe in anything, you'll fall for everything. That's where they have come to. So that's number one. I think number two is that we have a misunderstanding of how to apply the gospel of the kingdom throughout culture. In American Christianity, there has been a shift over the last 115 years. My friend Joe Matera, who I had on my podcast a few months back, wrote a little book called The Divided Gospel, The Consequences of Separating the Gospel of the Kingdom from the Gospel of Salvation. And he says that what happened is, beginning in the late 1800s and up through the time of the first quarter of the 20th century, Christianity moved increasingly towards a personalized view of salvation, which is important. It is true. Billy Graham's Crusades and so on, a personal relationship with Christ. Absolutely. What it then did as a result of a pendulum swinging was overlooked, but we have a responsibility as the corporate body of Christ to be that light and salt in the culture. We have that responsibility wherever we're placed to be that light and salt. And here's the upshot. You'll find people who work in the marketplace who feel like they're second-class Christians because they have never been taught that their ministry, quote unquote, is in the marketplace. I actually heard this back around 1980 when a pastor said, if you really want to serve Christ, be a pastor or a missionary. And I was confused by that because I didn't feel a call to either one of those. Fortunately, my spiritual father, the man discipling me, he walked me through this and said, no, you have to read Ephesians 4 very carefully. The work of the ministry is not ministry as we're defining it today. It's service. And it's service everywhere, wherever God has placed us. And so because we've had these distorted views, and there's other ones as well, all kind of come together in a kind of a toxic stew, the consequence has been this tension among evangelicals of, well, how active should I be? Should I vote? Does it make a difference? Is it a calling? How can, all these types of questions, when the simple answer is be a good citizen. Mm-hmm. Be a good citizen means be a good voter. And be a good voter means stand up against moral decay and evil. So if you've got two candidates to choose from, and one is pro-life and one is ardently pro-abortion, this shouldn't be a hard choice to make, at that point. Things of that nature. So we have that confusion out there. And then on top of it, Dave, the secular left fuels it because it attacks whenever it says Christians get too involved in politics. Well, that's not your call. That's not what you're supposed to do. And we let them define what we are to be called to do. I would argue this, especially on moral issues, there's not a political view. There is a biblical view. And we are to deal with those issues in that political realm, or in the education realm, or in the media realm, or in the arts and entertainment realm, through that biblical lens, and not let the secular left define for us things we cannot be part of. And they've used the whole separation of church and state, cudgel to beat us over the head.
That's right. Yeah, and they would attack in two different ways. One of which is if you speak to issues, they say keep your religion out of politics. And conversely, when you're speaking to a biblical issue, they politicize it. So they just simply step by step removed all those major moral issues out of the portfolio of the church by making them political.
Correct.
That's the enemy's methodology along the way. This is the incrementalism of the enemy. We misunderstand consistently, I think, in the church, especially as we moved away from the comprehensive of a framework of a biblical centrism, that we don't talk about sin, and we diminished our concept of the whole nature of the purpose of the cross. It's easier for us to look at, as well as Francis Schaeffer talked about, we see things in pieces instead of the whole.
Correct.
Right. For example, we're talking about keeping biological males out of girls' sports now, right?
Right.
Well, 10 years ago this year, we fought a battle in Houston that was themed fundamentally around keeping biological males out of girls' restrooms, right?
Right.
Well, 10 years before that, we were fighting a battle over the definition of marriage, whether it's between one man and one woman.
Right.
So here we are even talking about this shooter here today. Is it male? Is it female? Is it female because because that person called themselves it? Or, the concept of absolute principles, because we've moved away from applying the absolute truth of Scripture to the whole of all things. In other words, since the Bible is true, it's true for me, but that doesn't mean it's true at City Hall.
Right.
Really? Okay. But that separatism, as you described it, that began to happen then, which is compartmentalization, ultimately, of the church from the society, but then ultimately moved downstream and compartmentalized us as individuals, and then began to teach and say, well, your faith belongs here, but not here.
Right.
And then there you go. So as a businessman, I can go to church and I can go out and steal and rob people in the marketplace, and I feel comfortable because that's not church. Or I can get involved and I can go out and we talk about the 4 ways that every Christian votes as part of our ministry training with the Pastor Council, because the truth is, when it really comes down to governing and our civic duty, that role of our ministry, Romans 13 calls governing ministries as a minister of God for your good. Diakonos is the term.
Right.
When we look at the whole apologetic of governing, it's the exercise of authority. Between Rome, 1776, because what was going on in Rome was a continuance of what had happened a millennia before that, when ancient Israel rejected God and chose a king. And they granted to a man the authority of earthly governing that only belonged to God and was the best that he gave to the people, but we gave it away. So from that millennia, or for thousands of years, it was vested in kings that became tyrants.
Right. Right.
And then now in this country, that power of that authority that was vested in one man was divided amongst the people again.
Mm-hmm.
So we are carriers of God's authority to govern. The question is, how does that person who sits in that office receive that authority of all the people brought down to just that one person, whether it's a city councilman or a legislator or a congressman? It's called the vote. It's called an election. Right. That authority is going to get transferred every election, whether we show up or not. Right. And everybody's going to vote. In the imagery of Romans 13, that's the sword, right? But today, because that's called law enforcement, God ordained government to make laws, and he ordained government to enforce those laws, to protect the innocent. We enforce laws through law enforcement, and our law enforcement officers carry weapons. But that weapon is first in the hands of the citizenry, we the people. And the way we describe it is you file the serial number off, you wipe down the prints, and you throw your gun in the street. You don't register, you don't participate, you just going to give the authority away. The lethal force doesn't go away. You just handed it to the enemy by your lack of participation. You lost control over it. So the second way is we register our gun, and then we throw it in the street anyway. We don't show up. We all know that the numbers of people who actually vote as a percentage of registered voters is always a fraction, right? And then we get to those who say, I'm going to vote. Now I'm going to go out and open the bidding. I'm going to say, well, what's in it for me?
Right.
Tragically, that's how too many people, including too many Christians, vote. Mm-hmm. Well, how's that working? Or the fourth way, which let's just say it's God's way, which he gives us in Scripture. The most simple version of that is in Exodus 18:21, where Jethro goes to Moses and says, you go and choose from among the people able men who fear God, who love the truth, and who hate dishonest gain. And then you place them over. So we're going to vote one of those four ways every election. What if all of the folks who claim the name of Christ exercised that in the fourth way? What if just 60, 70, 80% of those who were serious believers in Christ did number four every election? What would our cities look like? I mean, maybe in another time, Guy, I want to dig in deeper into the details and the weeds of what difference does a biblical worldview make?
Right.
Because ultimately, do these principles we believe in matter to the rest of society?
Right.
And how does that play out? We talked about that on the earlier cast in terms of just crime, for example.
Well, let's look at it this way, Dave. When Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, okay? If I am voting for individuals who are going to uphold justice, I mean, let's look at you mentioned crime in the cities. How is this progressive, quote unquote, and I use that in air quotes because it's really very regressive, view of criminal justice reform, how is that helping the poor? How is that helping families in the inner city? It's not. They're the most likely victims of crime. And we're letting these criminals out on the street and doing things, and they're repeating. How is that loving your neighbor? Loving your neighbor says, I'm going to do something to protect you against these people who would foment crime against you, okay? So in the simplest illustration, it's an example of how you love your neighbor by how you vote. I just call it simply biblically informed voting. And I'll give you a quick example before we go to your next question of how important this is. In 1994, I was the consultant on a congressional campaign in Oregon, in the suburbs of Portland, where my candidate was a Christian and a moral conservative Christian, and our opponent was a freshman congresswoman who was a secular leftist. Out of 285,000 votes cast, we lost by 301 votes. 301, that's like about 0.1%. Were there 300 Christians in that area that didn't vote? I'm sure of it.
Absolutely.
Were there 300 who voted but voted uninformed? Absolutely. Simple example of how much difference even just one informed vote can make.
Well, and then carrying that forward, Guy, then the difference in the lives of the people that we are called to love and to preach to then is what? When you put that leftist progressive in that office who votes to, for example, fully legalize abortion, taking of innocent human life until birth, who votes to legalize and destroy marriage as God's design, who votes to turn criminals loose out into the streets, to take more money out of the pockets of working families. These aren't just policy issues. These are things that we now look around us and
they have real life,
tangible consequences.
Tangible consequences, correct.
Yeah. And well, Guy, I do want to have you back because, again, there's so much that I've learned from you over the years. And I know that you have to bring to bear in terms of things that we have to bring back to the church. And this has been our mission to say, look, pastors, your role as a shepherd charged with making disciples. That's the call of the Great Commission. The call of the Great Commission begins with an assertion by Christ where he's reminding us that says all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him.
Right.
That framework of comprehensively bringing our faith into the full areas of every part of our life is something we want to dig in a little more deeply to. But just in closing here, because that's still what you're called to do. And you're doing that, and you're doing it now through this framework of leadership coaching. Just a little description about what you do and what you're offering in that.
Yeah, so I'm a certified professional leadership coach. I went through training to do this, which really was a culmination on top of all the leadership experiences I've had over the course of 35 years. I have a podcast called Flourishing Leadership, which your listeners can find at my website, which is flourishing-leadership.com. And I have a book that's going to be coming out, and I know you're going to really be interested in this. We'll be talking about this later. And the title is Emails with Martin, A Biblical Lens into the Worldview, Thinking, and Behavior of the Secular Left. And it's based upon 6 years of emails with a boyhood friend who had become a secular leftist as an adult. And what I learned about secular leftism, not so much from an ideological perspective, because I was fully aware of it, but how it's played out through the life of an individual and how he looks at the world, how he thinks, how he applies things, how he comes to conclusions. I think going to be a fascinating read for people to understand what we're really dealing with today, because I believe that we've come to a place, we're coming to a head between a conflict between ideological secular leftism and biblical Christianity. That's where this is going, and it's heading there fast. And the question, are we going to stand for what is true and right and good for people and loving your neighbor, or are we going to allow this ideology, which is radical, which is destructive, and yes, evil, to then permeate all of society? What does that mean in terms of us being salt? That's what I'm doing, flourishing-leadership.com. I encourage your listeners to check it out.
Absolutely. And we'll post that on ours as well. And we'll have you back because there's some issues I want to talk about. We talk about education, but of course, in the state of Texas here, and as in many of the states now, there's a big raging battle going on about school choice. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? And why is that important? You talked about the homeschool debates back in those years, but from a biblical worldview and our standpoint of educating our children, it doesn't matter whether we put them in government schools. Should government be educating our children? All those different questions along those lines. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership. And we'll look forward to having you back as we work to educate pastors and our church leaders, not just about how do we vote biblically, but how do we live according to Christ and have an impact in the culture around us. Because there are a number of things we know that are absolutely true, that Jesus Christ still saves, right? That he transforms lives, that transforms marriages. Yep. Marriages that transform families that transform the communities that can transform a city. The power is still there. The truth is still there. He is still there. So if we see a nation going the wrong direction, where does the fault lie? And is it corrective? That's where our commitment is to say, on our watch, let's do better and let's stand there. Thank you, Guy, for your work, and look forward to having you back.
Well, thanks for having me, Dave.